since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and as attention turns to what a possible end to the conflict could look like, for many displaced families, the search for their loved ones continues. Our Eastern Europe correspondent Sarah Rainsford has been to meet one woman whose parents are amongst an estimated 60,000 missing soldiers and civilians who have disappeared following the occupation of a vast area of the east of the country.
From occupied southeastern Ukraine, a message of reassurance and love. From parents to a daughter, separated by Russia's invasion of their country. Lyudmila shows me her phone, full of memories, of a couple full of energy and life. But in September 2023, Oleg and Tatyana were detained by the Russians and disappeared. For 4 months, Lyudmila had no information at all. Then Russian soldiers dumped her mother at a hospital in a coma. She died without ever coming round.
It's just so tough to think what they did to her and why. My mom was 51. She loved life. Then everything was cut short. She was such a radiant person. For me, she's still alive.
Her father, Oleg, has still not been found.
If, God forbid, something happens to my dad, it will kill me.
When the Russian army took over Lyudmila's town, many Ukrainians there protested. But gradually, the resistance in Melitopol was crushed as the Russians began rounding up those suspected of siding with Kyiv. Lyudmila now knows her mother was charged with espionage. But despite all these official papers from the Russian side, she's no closer to knowing where Tatyana was held, how she came to die, or what has happened to her father. Ukraine's police force is trying to find Oleg and all this country's missing civilians. This officer didn't want to be identified, but he did show me how they work.
The police officer here is just explaining how they use facial recognition software to try to find some of the missing. And they have Lyudmila's father's photograph on their database, and they've been looking for him, thinking perhaps the pro-Russian or the Russian authorities might post something online, and that might be one way of finding him. But there's been no trace at all of Oleg.
Sometimes the missing do turn up. Leonid was also detained by the Russians in Melitopol. 3 months later, he showed up in hospital, his body, evidence of what he'd been through. His family, now abroad, tell me Leonid then vanished again for a whole year. He's now facing trial in Russia, accused of taking photographs of the military that had occupied his town.
He'd been in the most terrible conditions. He said, "Mom, in a word, I was in hell." He said, "When I was a kid, you used to talk about heaven and hell. I was in hell."
It is stories like Leonid's, however tough, that give Lyudmila hope. That her father too is somewhere in a basement or a Russian prison cell and still waiting to be found. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News, Kyiv.
To Germany.